Russia, quite literally, is ceasing to exist, not just as a government or as a state, but as a people. And now that Russia has surpassed over 1 million soldiers killed or injured in Ukraine, with at least a quarter of them, 250,000, presumed dead, this is more than just the largest military loss for Russia since World War II. This is something that's permanent because the men dying are exactly the group, exactly the generation that Russia cannot afford to lose. And the reason is very simple, is that most of the men dying are young. Most of the men dying are of working age. And all of the men dying have the potential to be fathers. And for a country that's already in demographic freefall, that's a disaster. So for Russia, this is more than just a military setback. This is a demographic death sentence. Putin's war is accelerating a collapse from which no country has ever recovered or come back from. Let's look at the numbers. Russia's current population is about 146 million. That's down 1.2 million people since 2021. And that's despite the government's efforts to boost the birth rates. And according to Rosstat, the Russian government's own statistics agency, that number could fall to 130 million people by 2046. By 2050, it could be just 121 million people. And in 75 years from now, it could be as low as 74 million people. And if current trends continue, low fertility, high mortality, mass immigration, Russia could have as few as 40 million people in 200 years. That'd make Russia smaller than the current population of Poland. And it's not only about how many people are disappearing, but about which people are disappearing. And that becomes an existential threat for everything that Vladimir Putin has sought to build. Because ultimately, this is destroying the foundation of how he defines Russia and how he wants to be remembered, his legacy. So since the early 2000s, Putin has promoted the idea of the Russian world, a vision in which Russia's identity, its strength, its destiny are tied to Orthodox Christianity, Slavic heritage, and imperial tradition. And in this worldview, true Russianness means being a white ethnic Russian and Orthodox. And that idea is not just cultural, it's political. Because it's how the Kremlin seeks to justify its grip on power and to justify its wars of aggression as essentially holy wars. But now, that entire foundation is crumbling. Because the very people that Putin built this vision around, the ethnic Russians, are disappearing the fastest. Meanwhile, the communities that the Kremlin has always sought to marginalize, especially those from the Muslim majority regions of Russia, like Dagestan and Chechnya, well, they're continuing to grow steadily. In fact, in 2010, Muslims were a little bit less than 12% of Russia's population. By 2050, they could exceed 20%. Now, that shift isn't inherently a crisis or a problem, but for a regime that defines national identity through Orthodox ancestry and being Slavic, well, this is a direct ideological threat. Because what do you do? What does any regime do when your model population is vanishing and those who you sought to sideline are growing more numerous? And then it gets worse, which is a good tip whenever you're trying to analyze something in Russia. If it can get worse, it usually does. My name is Jason J. Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kiev Post. And for the past 2 decades, I've studied Russia and the Putin regime, which I've worked against during that whole period of time. And the situation within Russia is truly incredible. And it's something that a lot has been written about, a lot has been published about. And the more you read about it, the worse it gets. So let's get into the numbers of exactly what's going on inside of Russia and see what the truth is. What is really happening? And just one favor, please like this video and please subscribe so that more people know the truth of what is happening inside of Russia. So let's go back to the demographics. Russia has just 0.86 men for every woman, and that's contributing strongly to the disastrous birth rate of just 1.4 children per woman. That's far less than 2.1 children per woman needed to have replacement. That is, if the population remains stable. And in the first 3 months of 2025 alone, Russia recorded more than 184,000 deaths than births. And Russia's losing people in other ways as well. Since the full-scale invasion, over 900,000 people, mostly young, educated men, have fled the country. And that's why Russia today is forced to find alternatives. It's part of the reason why Russia is today's conscripting men that are aged 40 to 60 with no military training, pulling them out of the workforce. And typically, they'd never come back home. This is Russia destroying itself, setting itself on fire. And Russia has another problem: age. The median age in Russia is 41.9 years. That's 10 years older than the global median age of 31. Now, by the early 2030s, in the near future, the working age population will collapse. And it's just as the number of retirees will explode. So the retirees are dependent on the state, yet there's going to be fewer taxpayers, fewer workers, and fewer people able to contribute to the state. It also means there'll be fewer soldiers. And Vladimir Putin saw this coming. In fact, for the past 25 years, he claimed that he would do what was necessary to reverse the demographic decline. And he spent billions of dollars on maternity subsidies, tax breaks, youth indoctrination programs, my favorite being Nashi, which was the one that famously warned the youth that the woolly mammoth went extinct because, quote, it did not have enough sex. And the message was very simple: reproduce or Russia dies. But then Vladimir Putin, paranoid and, as always, most interested in protecting his own power, dismantled the organization after the Arab Spring. It was decided that it was probably dangerous to have too many young people who were well organized. So this selfish decision contributed to Russia's further decline. And we see that Russian leaders throughout history make really bad decisions. They make decisions that have destroyed Russia demographically. Now, in World War I, Russia lost 1.7 million soldiers. In World War II, 27 million Soviet lives were taken. But then Stalin, in his Great Terror, executed over 1 million people and sent another 1.7 million to the gulags. And we see Putin's total disinterest in what happens to his soldiers. Just look at the waves of poorly trained conscripts sent into the slaughter in places like Bakhmut and Divka. In the case of Bakhmut alone, Russia had over 100,000 casualties. But unlike in the past, this time is not like World War II. There's not going to be a baby boom waiting on the other side of the war. And since the 1990s, Russia's been in decline even more dramatically than before. It's been in a demographic tailspin. Life expectancy has plunged. We've seen that the birth rates have totally collapsed. And at the same time, other things like alcoholism and HIV have exploded. Today in Russia, the life expectancy for man is only 67 years old. In Western Europe, it's 78. And in some rural areas of Russia, where you have the most incredible social problems, alcoholism has surged by more than 30% in the past year alone. And 70% of deaths are linked to alcohol. These are not good demographics for your population, not good statistics. Because what we see is that Russians over the age of 15 consume an average of 8 liters of pure alcohol annually. And in poor areas, it's substantially more. This is not just some casual drinking or traditional Russian drinking, it's a lethal addiction. And when you couple that with the other problems, such as the 1.1 million Russians that are currently living with HIV, the highest rate in Europe, it looks worse. Some areas of Russia, 1 in 50 adults is HIV positive. And most estimates is that less than half of them receive treatment. But HIV is also fueling a rise in multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. And both diseases are quietly devastating the workforce. When I lived in Russia as a student many, many years ago, you were required to get an HIV test in order to get your residency permit. And I will never forget being lined up with all the other American students to go get this test. And in that test at the Communicable Disease Hospital, they have a large waiting room. And that waiting room is filled with two major types of people: those that are there to get an HIV test and those that are there to get a tuberculosis test. What was perhaps the most incredible thing to me was to think, hearing all the people coughing, is that we have a bunch of people here who have potentially immune systems that are compromised sitting next to people with tuberculosis. And sure enough, at the test center, you should probably not be surprised, they reused the needles to do the prick on your finger to get the blood to do the test. That's how Russia deals with things like this. And that's probably why things are only getting worse. But Russia has other problems as well. In fact, Russia today has one of the highest suicide rates in Europe. And as I said, when you go to the rural areas, it gets really bad. That's where you see the statistics that are just out of this world about the domestic abuse, the drug addiction, the alcohol addiction, and all of it's feeding into the downturn of the Russian economy. Rosstat, the Statistics Bureau, says that Russia's labor force will probably shrink by another 10 million people by 2030. 13% loss within 5 years. Now, over time, it's expected that with a 25% drop in the working age population by 2050, Russia could lose 30% of its GDP. And by 2075, that could be 50% of the GDP. And even oil will not save Russia because there's a collapsing workforce and an exploding pension system that will devour any sort of gains. And if you want to see how disastrous this situation is in Russia, just zoom out of Moscow, zoom out of St. Petersburg. Russian villages are quite literally disappearing. In fact, over 20,000 villages are now fully abandoned. There's another 36,000 villages with less than 10 residents. Between 2002 and 2010, over 6,000 rural settlements vanished completely. And in some parts of the country, such as Pskov, Tver, Arkhangelsk, Magadan, local governments have just totally given up on maintaining the roads or the utilities. And the reason is very pragmatic and very simple. There's nobody left to use them. And that's how a country dies. Not in a fire or a revolution, but in silence, in this shrinkage, in tens of thousands of forgotten places all at the same time. It's a collapse by math, and it's been sealed by war. And ultimately, it's being made irreversible by the current Putin regime. So Putin has detonated a demographic time bomb, and he has no defusal plan. And unlike earlier times in Russia, a century ago or during the Second World War, Russia could afford to lose millions. But it was okay because there would be a baby boom. But this time around, there's no generation left to rebuild. Russia has put itself into an untenable situation, a situation from which it cannot dig itself out. And no matter how you look at it, Vladimir Putin's decisions contributed greatly to how Russia got to where it is today, and why the situation within Russia itself is going to get far worse, and there should be no expectation that it will ever get better. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.